Yes, a very warm welcome to everybody in the room here, everybody who's lucky enough to obtain a ticket, and a warm welcome to the viewers at home as well. My name is Yuri Albrecht, I'm the director of the Balie, and I will try to moderate this evening. It's called Europe at War, and there is, in a good Dutch tradition, a question mark behind that. That's a very sort of journalistic thing. If we Dutch don't really know whether we're allowed to ask this or not, then we have this question mark. But these are trying times. These are interesting times. There's a Chinese curse, of course, may you live in interesting times. And The Economist this week had an interview, I think for the second time, with the French president, Europe in mortal danger. And he says very interesting things, I think, in it. There's been interesting comments on it already as well, written in The Guardian today by one of our speakers today. So these are very topical things indeed. Europe is at war. At least I personally think so, and it's a good moment to start this conversation. So we're doing this evening, it's a part of a whole series, In the Face of War, European Dialogue, initiated by the Institut Français and organized here tonight in partnership with us, the Balie, the Institut Français in Holland, Arte, Ouest France, Le Grand Continent, and the European Cultural Foundation as partners. We're very happy with those partners, and the project aims to foster a dialogue and debate surrounding the upheavals in Europe, instigated by the war in Ukraine, and by other things probably, but by the war in Ukraine, of course, it makes it very, very urgent. Following a project launch in Prague already, and the second editions in autumn 2023, there will be 5 events, and they will be held during the course of 2024 in Warsaw, Sofia, Helsinki, Amsterdam, and Rennes. I think it's in Rennes because Ouest France is from Rennes. It's the biggest France media company. This is the second program this evening. We had just one very insightful discussion, I have to say, with different European journalists on the role of war reporting. And tonight we will discuss what kind of geopolitical actor Europe wants to be in the light of the current conflict, such as, of course, the war in Gaza and the war in Ukraine. And what is the EU global role and identity? We'll do this together with 4 excellent speakers, excellent because of their expertise and experience. Also, I'm very pleased that we have around 15 students, I think, here in the room from the UvA and Paris 8, the 2 universities, who were here the whole day discussing their visions on Europe, where is Europe and where is Amsterdam. And we have also here in the front row the French ambassador, François Alabrune. A very warm welcome to you, Mr. Ambassador, as well. We'll start this evening by listening to our first guest, Frans Timmermans, here on the front row. I have to say he has to leave at 9:45, so there will be a possibility of questions, which we always do in the Balie to involve the public. But he has to leave because he has to catch the last train, and the last train in Holland. Well, that's a wonderful film, I think, a French film about Paris. Yeah. Frans Timmermans, I introduce him briefly. Among many other things, the political leader of the GroenLinks Partij van de Arbeid, Green Left Labour Party. Before this, he was vice president of the European Commission and involved with the European Green Deal and European Commissioner for Climate Action. He was Minister of Foreign Affairs here in the Netherlands. He was in the second cabinet of Mark Rutte, who's in his last cabinet now, we think. And State Secretary of Foreign Affairs from 2007 to 2010 already, in the first Balkan and the cabinet. So he's one of our most experienced foreign policy makers, I would say. So we're very, very fortunate that we have him here tonight in this topic. Frans Timmermans, thank you very much. I will leave the floor to you. Warm welcome to you. A warm applause to Frans Timmermans.
Yes, Yuri, you're not exaggerating when you're saying a warm welcome, because it's indeed quite warm here. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, and especially in the presence of so many important people who think about the future of Europe, people who write about it, people who have long experience in security policy, and especially young people who want to acquire that experience for themselves. And that's why the first thing I want to do is take you back to the years I was studying in France, 84, 85. So right after the invention of the wheel, to the young people in the audience. And at the time we had a conference like this, very much about European security, what's going to happen in Europe. It was, keep in mind that only a couple of years before we were on the verge of an open conflict with the Soviet Union because Mr. Andropov thought that he was going to be attacked by NATO, and thanks to British intelligence, this was discovered, and then some exercises were cancelled, which sort of dropped the level of anxiety in the Soviet Union. So just 2 years after that, I was studying in France, and then the debate was about what's going to happen in Europe. And a colonel from the French army stood up, and he had a question. He said, if Germany is going to be unified, reunified, obviously it will not be a member of NATO. Obviously it cannot be a member of the EU. We would have a neutral Germany at the heart of Europe. What does that mean for our security? And then, as one woman and man, all the Germans got up, asked for the floor and said, what a ridiculous proposition. Germany reunited. Unthinkable. This is 4 years before it actually happened. So the lesson I learned as somebody who studied foreign policy is never think something is unthinkable. At the same time, some of the same people who had said it was unthinkable after November '89 said, well, it was inevitable. It was inevitable. So people can go from unthinkable to inevitable with a bit of intellectual gymnastics, but this is what you see quite a lot in foreign policy, and I want you to keep that concept in mind. I had the same experience a couple of years later when I was a young diplomat in first the Soviet Union, then Russia, and because we had a military attaché in Moscow who loved to travel across the Soviet Union, had set the goal that he would travel everywhere, but the ambassador, you need to know in diplomacy, there's always mild tension between the people from the Foreign Office and the people from the Defense Ministry. And I shan't elaborate on that a lot, but the ambassadors really like to know what their military attachés are up to. So I was sent with him to travel across this Soviet Union. And I came back and I said to the ambassador, I want to write a report to The Hague. I think this place is going to fall apart. And he said, until then, I thought you were going to have a brilliant career in the foreign ministry. But if you write that nonsense to The Hague, you'll end your career. And I'll not sign off on it. I will not do it. It's nonsense. And I asked him why. He said, well, it's not in their interest to fall apart. And by the way, it's also not in our interest. And this is another wrong way of rationalizing foreign policy. It was not in the interest of the constituent parts of the former Yugoslavia to go to war with each other. It was not in the interest of the republics of the Soviet Union that they would fall apart. It was not the intention of Yeltsin to end the Soviet Union. He wanted to remove the Central Committee of the Communist Party. And in doing that, he actually killed the Soviet Union because he misunderstood that the Communist Party was a cement keeping together the Soviet Union, not state structures. But anyway, I don't want to go too far into that. But the other concept I want you to just keep in mind is that in foreign policy, many consequences are unintended. So get rid of the attitude things are unthinkable. Get rid of the attitude things are unavoidable, because they're not unavoidable. And also lose the attitude that people will always rationalize, and countries and politicians act in their self-interest rationally and don't make decisions that take them in a different direction. I say this, and now I want to move quickly to today. There's enough politicians reminiscing about the past. We need to look at the future. If I look at the geopolitical situation in Europe today, we are at the end of a very, very long period of incredible economic growth because of incredible low interest rates, because of a huge increase in knowledge that helps the economy, because of a lot of political stability after the end of the Cold War. A lot of things were going our way, and we started assuming this was the natural situation, the natural situation to be in. we now understand that this was an exceptional period, and that period has come to an end. So the challenges we face are a lot bigger. And I think this is part of the reason why many people in Western societies do not like to be confronted with that challenge and prefer being put asleep by a story about nostalgia, about the greatness of the past, that if you just choose the nationalistic way, you will recreate the greatness of the past and you will not be bothered with all the challenges of the future. It's a very, very dangerous way, this nostalgia, of avoiding the confrontation with reality. Nostalgia is like good wine. Wonderful, 1 glass, 2 glasses, I say in the presence of the French ambassador, especially French wine. But if you start drinking whole bottles, you'll lose your way. And this is what I see a lot in European societies, that people are living on a nostalgia that has nothing to do with the realities of today, let alone of tomorrow. So they fear tomorrow too much and are then tempted into a story about the past. And then, of course, if that story does not deliver, there's always someone you can blame. And mostly that's a foreigner, that's a person who's different, that's a person who has other ideas. And this dynamic in our society is causing a lot of harm, and I think it's high time we weaponed ourselves against this and had the courage to face the future. Because although we have a lot of challenges, there's no reason why we should be afraid of the future unless we abandon the choice to shape our future. Now, in the international arena, obviously, Putin's, I could talk about hours about Putin, whom I first met in Petersburg in 91, but shan't do that, perhaps for another evening. But his calculation is that in attacking Ukraine and then creating an alliance with countries that all want to get rid of American dominance, he could actually bring about a change of course in Europe, and he could create a permanent alliance with countries that all share one goal, and that's get rid of the American influence or the American dominance. The countries he's aligned himself with very strongly, and you can look at the numbers of weapons, numbers of drones, numbers of technology, are essentially 3: Iran, North Korea, and China. And all of them have essential contributions to his war effort in Ukraine. He could not maintain this war effort in Ukraine if he did not get the support from these 3 countries. At the same time, because his defense industry is churning out new stuff all the time, these 3 countries profit a lot from the defense knowledge he then gives back to them, creating also a stronger position for them in the international community, which is a direct challenge. If they challenge the Americans, I mean, it would be tempting for Europeans to say, well, there's no skin off our back. No, they challenge not just the Americans as a country, they challenge the values and the way societies are organized. They challenge open societies, they challenge the rule of law, they challenge democracy itself, because they believe democracy is just one of the systems that compete with more efficient systems, such as, in their view, theirs. So if you want to analyze our potential in the coming years, you have to be aware of this dynamic between these 4 countries. That's the downside. The positive side is nothing binds them other than the wish to weaken the Americans and us. Because underneath that wish are a lot of contradictions. For the Chinese, it is wonderful. They were always dominated by Russia as big brother. Now they are the big brother. They always suffered Russian racism towards them. They now see this as payback time. But there is no love lost between these 2 nations. I was asked, so how, by a minister in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, how do you assess China's position in this war? And I said, well, China does not want the Russians to lose, doesn't really want the Russians to win. They just want this conflict to go on because it weakens all their potential competitors. And he said, sort of what we did during the Iran-Iraq war. And I think that's the logic. If you are if you pretend to increase your international position, and two of your potential competitors are at war, you say you choose sides, but at the same time you're just trying to keep this going as long as possible, so they are weakened and you become stronger. Now, what does this mean for the choices we have to make? I think first and foremost, it is of the essence that Putin does not win this war. I hope you understand, if you've listened to what I've said until now, if he wins this war, it's not just Ukraine that will crumble. It's the very idea that the United States and Europe together are not capable of even defending their direct interest in their own neighborhood. And that will have a huge international effect that goes way beyond just Ukraine. And it's not just about the Russians then going after the Baltic states, perhaps Poland, especially in Central Asia, especially in the Balkans. Yes, they will do that. But the loss of position of the collective West in international relations will be even worse than these concrete measures taken. And the loss of position has a huge effect on those countries that today are more or less on the fence, but also because of the Gaza crisis, are now pushed towards those four countries I mentioned before. The Gaza crisis, the Gaza war, is another contribution to this narrative which does find its way in the global South, that Americans and Europeans have double standards. Americans and Europeans have double standards. And this is, of course, exploited by our adversaries in China, in Russia, and elsewhere, in Iran. And it does make school in the global South. So if you agree with me that these four countries, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, for the time being, they are beyond our reach, they will stick together to try and weaken us, then after that you get a whole range of mid-sized countries of increasing importance, sometimes huge countries, who are on the fence, but looking towards them rather than towards us. Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, India, all countries, well, India, like Russia, profits hugely from imports from energy from Russia. But these countries are trying to make up their minds, where is our future? And we as Europeans, together with the Americans, would be well advised to try and find common ground with those countries before we lose them to this coalition against us. And I think the time we have for this is not very long. And I insist on one point, and I do it really in the presence of the French ambassador, because this is a message I would love to send to Paris. The disenchantment, disillusion, anger even of my friend Lula in Brazil because we are not delivering on the trade treaty, Mercosur treaty, that he was promised and he was hoping for, drives them also more in the direction of the Chinese. He didn't need much encouragement. He was already halfway there. But this is helping to not create better relations with countries in Latin America. So I know trade policy today is very unpopular across the board, but we have to think about trade policy in terms of geopolitical interests, and we're not doing that enough. And this, I think, is very, very urgent. Also because the economy, industry, is changing at a pace which is breakneck right now. And factors contributing to the strengthening of our adversaries are, for instance, the energy transition, which is sped up in India and especially in China in a way that we haven't seen before. New technologies. Russians and Chinese are actively developing, I find this extremely scary, actively developing artificial intelligence for military purposes. And this could be a direct threat for us. The scale with which they are building drones, which is a new weapon on the battlefield between Iran and Russia, is incredible. So, brings me to another factor which I want to address before I end. If you agree with me that what's at stake in Ukraine is much more than just the freedom of Ukraine, but also Europe's destiny, Europe's future, we need to carefully study the battlefield situation in Ukraine, because new military technologies, new military approaches, new military tactics are always formed very rapidly in war situations. And I think we need to be very clear in how we respond to those threats. What do we do with the new technology? What do we do with drones? Where do we invest? And I think in a time where money is short, and the economy is not booming as much as we hoped, we will have to start spending more on defense than we have done for a long, long time. And most countries in NATO are struggling to reach the 2%. But frankly, I have to tell you, I'm not sure how long that 2% will be enough. And I think it is of vital importance that we start investing quickly, that we do it on a European scale, that we stop competing against each other in the defense industry, that we start creating European champions in the defense industry, and that we sort of focus on those parts of the defense industry that behold the future, which especially is linked to drones, to unmanned aerial aircraft, to new types of ammunition, to communication material, etc., all these things that Tom Middendorp knows much more about than I do. But that is the challenge we face today. So my message to you is perhaps a tough one, but it's also lined with a lot of hope. If we understand the strategic importance of working closely with the United States of America, which might become a lot more difficult in November, but I hope not. If we understand that the United States, yes, they are competitors in certain economic areas, but for our security, they are essential contributors to our security. If we understand that, if we understand that Europe's destiny will be decided on the battlefields of Ukraine, much like it was decided more than 100 years ago at Verdun and elsewhere, if we understand that, then there's nothing that can stop us to make sure Ukraine comes out of this victorious and that we come out of this stronger. Our strategic depth is a lot deeper than what Putin has to offer, even though today it looks different. And I want to quote one of the biggest philosophers this country has ever produced. That's Johan Cruyff from this city, who said about the Italians, they can never beat you, but you can lose to them. And this is what I want to say about Putin. He cannot beat us, but we can lose to him if we are divided, if the nationalists get the upper hand in more and more countries. Don't underestimate them. They all admire him. They're hiding it now, but once this war is over, and would he come out victorious, they're all his friends again. So we have to be very, very careful what direction we take, and the European elections are going to be crucial. I think in June, the center can hold in Europe. I think it can hold. Unless the Conservatives make the tragic mistake they've made in Italy, they've made in Sweden, they've made in Finland, they're making here in the Netherlands, of thinking they can neutralize the radical right by joining them. In all of these examples, whether it's Italy or Sweden or Finland, and I hope not here, but we're on the verge of that, the opposite happened. Once you align yourself as a conservative with a radical right, you will be eaten by them. And that brings me to, and then I'll end, to the definition of an appeaser, once given by the great Winston Churchill. An appeaser is someone who feeds the crocodile, hoping the crocodile will eat him last. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have to take a breath after your amazing speech. Thank you very much for your thoughts, your insights. I'm going to ask two other people at the table and introduce them, and we will look into your speech a little bit more if we might. I'm inviting Nathalie Tocci and Momtaz to join me here at the table at those two chairs maybe. Yes, wonderful you're both here. Let me briefly introduce you both. Nathalie Tocci is director of the Institut Affari Internazionali, Institute for International Affairs, of course, part-time professor at the School of Transnational Governance. I think that's at Fiesole, isn't it? Yes, the European University Institute. And honorary professor at the University of Tübingen, many other things, but she has been also special advisor to the EU High Representative Federica Mogherini and to Josep Borrell. Warm welcome to you. Wonderful you're here. And Riem Momtaz, on the other side of the table, multiple Emmy Award-winning journalists. In 2010 and 2011, Momtaz served as special assistant to the Lebanese permanent representative in the United Nations and took part in high-level negotiations over the armed intervention in Libya. She was correspondent for Politico Europe, and currently works as a consultant research fellow for the European Foreign Policy Security at the International Institute of Strategic Studies. Welcome, both journalists and academics on international affairs. It's wonderful to have you here. Well, let's just start with what was the most important thing Frans Timmermans said? Now, what, according to you two?
Shall I start?
Please.
Well, I think Frans was absolutely right. It is, well, firstly, I think
I'm so sorry, you're totally right.
Understanding that what happens in Ukraine is integral to European security, I think is of the essence. I think that what is key is not only is it of the essence for European security, what would happen to Moldova, you know, as opposed to the Baltics, as opposed to Poland, etc. But I think the broader point that he was making is, what does this say about us? I mean, if this goes wrong, what does this say about us?
And who are us, in your opinion?
My us is Europe. Okay. What does it say about us if, at the end of the day, we cannot stop a revisionist power, which, frankly speaking, is kind of a little bit, I mean, they're not that strong, right? I mean, we're talking about a declining demography, we're talking about a declining economy, we're talking about an army which, you know, in all fairness, has adapted, but frankly speaking, was not exactly the mighty force that we imagined. So if we lose to that, what are the global consequences of it? Now, my view and what I worry about a lot is the way in which, although in a sense we could have probably won this war already, I think we were scared of it.
Scared to win it?
I think we were scared to win it. I think that we've been paralyzed by our fear. Not paralyzed, because in fairness, we did do a number of things and a number of very important things. But every time, you know, especially if you go back to 2020...
So you're asking the question, what does that say about us? And you say, actually, if we agree with Frans Timmermans, and you do, then it says about us that we're afraid.
I think that fear is a very important emotion that explains a lot of what we're doing and what we're not doing in Europe, whether you're looking at it in terms of Ukraine, in terms of the Middle East, in terms of our inaction in Gaza, our fear of migration in North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, our total paralysis vis-a-vis the United States, thinking, you know, what's going to happen if Trump comes? Are we even beginning to have the conversation about, I don't know, how we should coordinate about it? No, we're not. So total paralysis. And I think if you don't bring in fear as part of the equation, it's very difficult to understand what we're doing, what we're not doing. Now, on Ukraine specifically, I think fear has worked both ways, and a kind of, you know, damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of predicament that we put Ukraine in. When Ukraine does well, think about the 2022 Kharkiv and Kherson offensive, then we were like, oh my God, shit, you know, nuclear Armageddon if they win, and what happens if Russia implodes, and all the rest of it. Then when Ukraine does badly, i.e. now, then we give it another Patriot, another SAMP-T, another... the cruelty of it, if you think of it, is incredible, right? I mean, you have to wait, for another attack in Kharkiv to give a Patriot that was collecting dust in our own countries, preventing a war of, you know, I'm not quite sure when. I mean, the war is now.
It's a very strong point. So we're so afraid that we're afraid for the Russians to win and for the Ukrainians to win.
Lose. Exactly. So we don't want either, right?
No.
And in a sense, that fear, which has kind of squeezed our action, is, I think, part of the reason why this war is actually that is prolonging the war and therefore is increasing the deaths.
So our foreign policy, our European foreign policy, Ursula von der Leyen announced a geopolitical commission when she started, is shaped by fear.
Look, I think, we've done a lot. I don't want to kind of overdo this, right?
But not enough.
Not enough, exactly. I think that this is really a situation whereby if you look at it from the inside out, then you kind of pat yourself, or rather you pat, others on the back saying, look at what we've done, and defence was a dirty word in Brussels, or at least on one side of Brussels, and we've done a lot on the European Peace Facility, and hey, we're great, and we've revived enlargement, and we've hosted refugees, and we've decoupled energetically from Russia, so we've done a lot. Looking at it from the inside out. The problem is that, you kind of have to look at it the other way around. So what is the snapshot today? And the snapshot today is that Ukraine is losing this war. And as Frans was saying, this was a war, this is a war for us, this is not it's a perfectly winnable war.
So okay, let's it might very well be, but maybe with the Chinese and the Iranians behind it, maybe not. But anyway, what would your reaction be before I go to on sort of? You seem to be agreeing on sort of the gravity of the moment, but this fear thing, are we too afraid? Don't we move enough?
I think we lack the imagination to see what's happening. We are too much stuck in the mold that we created when the wall came down, and we thought that was going to be Europe from now on, and we would slowly expand our stability to new member states, etc. We just lack the imagination at this stage to see how disruptive and dangerous Putin is.
So you would say we're not afraid enough?
I think we just it is what he wants to achieve to many, many people is still unimaginable.
Right.
People still think, well, he'll catch Kiev and he'll stop there. And that is very much reminiscent of how large parts of Europe treated Hitler when he started expanding. That's exactly the same phenomenon.
So you would say we lack the imagination of, things can be so much worse, we can't imagine how bad they actually can be.
Well,
so we're not afraid enough.
And then we underestimate the power we have to respond. We could respond much more strongly and put him in his place. He's not that strong.
Exactly.
But yes, he's got nuclear weapons, but he will not use the nuclear weapons. I'm quite convinced of that. But it's not that the economy is the size of Spain's economy.
Right.
Yes, it's a big gas station, so there's a lot of gas to sell, and there's a huge amounts of money coming in. But we've lost so much time and given them and they've surprised me, frankly. Their way of adapting in the military sphere is incredible and scary, frankly. But still, I don't see them as a mortal threat unless we let them be a mortal threat. And my final point is this: he has now, like Stalin, he has callously led probably hundreds of thousands of young Russians to their deaths. And he can do this because he controls the information, but this will have huge repercussions on Russian society quite quickly. And so, again, he's not that strong.
Riem, Momtaz, thank you very much, both. Your first comment on...
I mean, it's great because I kind of agree with what was just said.
Very sad.
Very sad.
Well,
but I think that's also what I want to get at.
It's also great because...
I think the thing that to me is very important, what you said, is talking about the changing of the world order and the changing context in which Europe and Europeans live in today. And I think on that level, there's a real disconnection with reality, despite the return of reality in a very vicious way over the past 2 years. there's a bubble of self-delusion that still exists, I think, in most European countries about the realities of the world, about what is required.
And where is this bubble? In Europe, but in the heads of governments or the people or both? Or?
I think in various ways it's in both, not in the same way. And not, by the way, to the same degree. So there are some policymakers who have completely understood that this is happening and have drawn the right conclusions, but are having a very hard time getting stuff done in order to put in place the responses that are needed. I think also, in all of my conversations in settings like this, there's always people who are very upset when I start saying, Europe was given an exceptional peace bubble for 70 years, something
70, you mean? Yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
Something that no other region in the world has ever benefited from. And that's the advantage that the rest of the world has over Europeans, which is that they have 70 years of experience ahead on Europeans in terms of dealing with a world where power dynamics are king, where there aren't a lot of rules, where there are rules sometimes and the same rules don't apply in other places. And it's not just about a double standard, it's just about finding opportunities and kind of the law of the jungle in a way. And that's something that I think Europeans need to really be much more open to, without falling into the defeatism or the pessimism of, well, this means that we're all just going to go to war again and we're all going to die and no one is going to live in peace anymore. That is not the message, because if that is the message, then we've already lost. Yep. And that's my second point, which is that I'm really struck by the crisis of confidence that Europeans have. I think that too many Europeans don't believe in their own power, in their own agency, in their own ability to do things. And you're right to say that the transatlantic partnership is very important and it is fundamental for European security. I would, I think, diverge with you on one point, which is that the change that is happening in the US now is not just Trump.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
And it is bipartisan.
Yeah.
It is not just Trumpism, it is not just Republicans, it is a generational shift. An important part of the younger Democratic generation doesn't have the same connection and engagement and commitment to Europe that their elders had, because they didn't go through the Cold War, and because, to be frank, they grew up thinking of Europe as a fancy place to go have a vacation. And so they don't understand in their minds, why should Americans continue paying for the security and defense of these people who clearly have better healthcare, better infrastructure, more vacation time, better beaches than we do? And that is a thing that comes up among Democrats, but also among Republicans. And I think that is something that people really have to, just accept. It doesn't mean that you have to completely break the relationship with the US. I don't think that's the right thing to do. But the transatlantic relationship has to evolve.
Absolutely.
And has to transform in a way that works for both sides. And I think we're very far from that. And until we resolve that together, Americans and Europeans, there is going to be this weakness, this latent weakness with the Western bloc. And I know that some in Europe don't like to talk in terms of blocs, but that is the way the rest of the world sees Europe and the US. And that, you have to live with that reality.
Can I briefly respond to this?
Yeah.
Because
Lou.
I fully agree with you. My fear in November is not the transatlantic tie. My fear in November is the United States turning away from democracy, because that's what's at stake in November, and that's a much, much bigger threat to us than whether they want us to spend more on defense and they want to do less for European defense. I don't fear that, neither with the Republican, not even with Trump, but I do fear this, if you ask a vice presidential potential candidate, will you respect the outcome of the election, they will not answer the question. So what's at stake in November in the US is democracy itself. And if that goes wrong, it's a much bigger threat to us than NATO or the transatlantic ties.
And that's a clarification, but that's also true, according to your speech right now, for us, of course.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And if you say the Europeans...
Well, it's a threat to us precisely because democracy in Europe itself is fragile.
Exactly.
That's what makes you know...
Thank you for the clarification. Yeah, but that's exactly the... Yeah. And if you say Europeans don't feel sort of the power they have, what would you say a European foreign policy would entail? What? Just briefly in 2 points, please.
Now we're getting into les choses fâcheuses. You know, talking about a European foreign policy to me is very difficult right now, given the utter division that we're seeing and complete uselessness. I'm sorry to talk this way.
No, please.
European foreign policy when it comes to what's happening in the Middle East. Yeah. And why do I talk about the Middle East? The Middle East isn't far away. It is the southern flank. It is the southern border of Europe. It has direct impact, not just on security, because everyone is worried about immigrants, but on a vast area of things, whether it's trade, whether it's inflation, like all sorts of stuff, but also in terms of, you know, Europe's ability to project power, Europe's ability to inspire respect, and be able to still be seen by other important partners as a worthy partner. Is Europe today showing a face that would inspire other countries, whether they're Arab countries or Latin American countries or Asian countries, to think, these are people that we would like to have on our side? Or is right now the impression that who cares what Europe thinks? Like, what difference does it make? And I'm sorry to say, sorry to be this blunt, but I think it's the second one, it's the latter one, and that is not good, because it's not true that Europe doesn't have anything to add. I think Europe has something very unique to add, and it is very important for Europe to understand that the world and the new world order that is now being created needs to have Europe part of it. It's not just about values, it's also about how the mediation role, the middle ground, because as we go to extreme, whether it's the American polity or the big challengers, China or Russia, nothing good ever comes from extremes. And so Europe does have a very unique role to play. I just don't think they figured out how to do it. And this division and this inability to understand and define common strategic goals that are realistic, that aren't esoteric, that aren't about, reinventing.
What would you say is esoteric in this respect?
I mean, there are too many conversations in Europe, I think, that are a bit too abstract. Is it about European strategic autonomy or sovereignty? Who cares? I mean, just kind of figure out what you need to do in order to have a voice and to be, agent of change in your own future. It doesn't matter if it's sovereignty or autonomy. It could be both.
Can I say something actually on the Middle East? Because I think there's a categorical difference between what we're doing in Ukraine and what we're not doing, more accurately, in the Middle East. So in Ukraine, the conversation is, we're doing the right thing. We should just be doing it, a lot more and a lot faster. Yeah, but at least we kind of, we have certain instruments that we're using for a particular goal, and it's the right one, broadly speaking. In the Middle East,
we're doing sort of half of it, but at least there's a direction.
Exactly, there's a direction. Exactly, there's strategy there somehow, right? In the Middle East, it's not. I think it's even worse than being divided.
Okay.
I wish the problem was just division. The problem is that we're very united in not wanting to use the instruments that we have, right? We are, at the end of the day, Israel's largest trading partner and the largest donor to the Palestinians. We have instruments. Yep. There is unity in Europe, not to use them, right? More so than in the United States. I mean, the United States suspended 3,500 bombs the other day. Would we ever even consider conditionality? Oh my God, never, right? So of course, the problem is that because I find there's a certain, in a sense, division, yes, it's true, but if you stop the analysis at division, in a sense, I think you're missing the bigger part of the problem, which is much, much graver.
If you're saying this, I really feel like, the worst student ever. Getting like all these comments on what we don't do and what we and the worst thing is I agree with what you're saying, but as a European, as a staunch European, I sort of feel like, oh my God, we have such bad notes. I mean, and then there's this other part. But you could do so much better. But you were involved in drafting a EU global strategy, and so in your view, what is actually I mean, this is really bad. We don't even have sort of objectives in the Middle East, and you're saying the same thing probably. And would you sort of agree?
Yeah, I agree.
Whoa.
I agree.
You've been in what's hampering us?
I agree.
What is the main factor why we don't?
At the same time, I think it can be fixed, but we're not fixing it.
Right.
And I think that is the main problem. Mm-hmm. And especially around Israel, for years we thought, wow, this is such an intricate problem. The Israelis are making all sorts of deals with all countries in the region. Yeah, tough enough for the Palestinians, but okay, it's quiet, so let's keep it like that. So we've neglected that issue for so many years, and now it's come back to haunt us.
And what are the main factors why we don't? Are we too stupid, too lazy? Is it just Orban who's all the time saying, no, we're not doing this?
This is one, and this is as somebody follows international politics. This is the one issue that goes immediately to the hearts and souls of Europeans. The one foreign policy issue where our influence, even if we would exert influence, is relatively limited, but it gets emotions so incredibly high. People identify with one or the other side in Europe in a way that you don't see.
So you mean the Israel-Gaza,
yes.
Israel-Palestinian conflict?
Exactly. And then European history comes into play, and then, of course, all sorts of people who try and instrumentalize so-called anti-Semitism because it's a good way.
Wouldn't you say, though, that it's become worse? What I mean by this is that there was a moment, right? I mean, if you go back to the end of the 90s, early 2000s, there was actually a fairly strong European consensus on what we wanted to see and what we were doing in the region. Of course, we were not, we were second fiddle to the United States. That's always been the case, and it probably always will be the case. But it's not like we were totally absent, So whereas I see some questions, Ukraine, to an extent, the transatlantic relationship, we at least know that, yes, obviously that partnership needs to remain there, but we need to become more responsible. So on some issues, I see a direction of travel. When it comes to the South, and actually I don't think it's just the Middle East, I think it's also in Africa where we've just totally abdicated on foreign policy, totally, just because of the fear, going back to fear of migration, right? But when it comes to the South, we're not, it's not like we're not going fast enough, but at least in the right direction. We're going backwards compared to where we were.
So what is actually part of, what should Borrell do? I mean, what's hampering it?
What's hampering him personally is the division. I mean, what he thinks personally, I think he's made fairly clear, right? And thank goodness, that at least in a kind of perverse way, thank goodness that division is there. At least he speaks for some, right? And he kind of makes some sense, because if there was unity and there was unity on the wrong position, what I think is the wrong position, it would be a lot worse. But of course,
could be after the next elections, of course, but European elections.
It could be worse. Yeah. It could be much worse.
There could be unity on.
Well, exactly. So this is why I'm saying, I wouldn't only focus on this question of unity, because it's always it can become a very lazy, quote unquote, explanation of why, Europe is not as strong as it could be. Yes, it's part of the explanation, but it's not the only one. At times, it's not even the most serious one.
But one of the big issues in Europe is that, as I tried to say before, that what unites the Russians with the North Koreans and the Chinese and the Iranians is not a collective vision of the future. It's the effort to weaken the Americans. This is what drives Orban. It's not a vision of the future. It's the effort to break down the EU as we know it. This is what drives the president of Serbia, Vučić, And then, of course, they are courted by Xi Jinping.
But it's not in Orban's interests, I would put to you, as you put so eloquently just before. If we looked at the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, it's not in Orban's interest to have the European fall apart.
Orban's interests are very, very materialistic. And they are well served by the money he gets from Putin. They are well served by when he can sort of avoid judges to do their job. And this is what he fears in Europe. It's the rule of law, it's democracy, it's the open society. That's what he fears. And so he does not have a better project. His idea is to weaken the project that he thinks is a threat to his personal wealth.
And then there are unintended consequences which will be dire for everybody, like you just...
Again, unintended consequences, and then they buy into a rhetoric which is like for Putin. Putin is not a convinced nationalist. Putin is a guy who's just looking after his assets, and he knows that nationalism and xenophobia helps him stay into control. And that's their idea. They don't really have an ideology. Their ideology is expressed in banknotes.
Riem, if I can put the same question to you, because you lived partly in the Middle East and you lived through several wars. So if you would say there's a lack, you seem to agree on, there's hardly anything coming out of Europe towards the Middle East. And that's not only, of course, the Palestinians and Israelis, it's much broader. So what would you say is sort of hampering the Union to do anything?
I think it's not just inaction. I think the action that has been taken has actually weakened Europe. And that is something that isn't talked about enough among Europeans. For example, now, if you walk around the Arab world, outside, of course, of the policy-making circles, people see that what the EU has been doing, the most important things that they've been doing, the most public things that they've been doing,
such as
is the same migration deal over and over again with a bunch of autocrats. I mean, that's what they are,
Whether that be Erdogan or
whether it's in Tunisia, whether it's in Egypt, whether it's like throw money at the problem, please make it disappear, bye-bye, we're no longer going to be here. And that's the way now Europe is seen. It's seen as this fortress that is, closing in on itself, that doesn't know how to deal with its own internal issues. And I don't think anyone should, oversimplify. Of course, there are also changes that are happening within European societies that are complex, that are tied to migration and immigration. That cannot also just be sort of, set apart and said, oh, this is not an issue. Of course, it is an issue. But the reaction has been one to, on the one hand, talk about, the importance of human rights and values and rule of law when it comes to Europe, when it comes to Ukraine, but on the other, be very happy about outsourcing European border controls to a bunch of people who have never heard of human rights and don't really care about rules. And so this does become a problem when it is a major driver of the offer that the EU and the Europeans make to others. Now, if Europeans didn't make it a major plank of their, foreign policy offer, it wouldn't be a problem. A lot of other countries and powers aren't coherent. But when you make it a central plank of your offer, you have to be coherent, at least on that. So that's the first thing. And then that has had also a part in the current Gaza conflict because, frankly speaking, the positions of some European countries have revealed that despite being the biggest humanitarian aid suppliers for the Palestinians, there is a lack of commitment to Palestinian human rights. And these are the terms in which not only Arabs are talking about Europe, but also some in Africa, some in Latin America. And, these are real issues that people have to think about. And so Europe's inaction, but also some of the actions that it is taking in the region are making things worse. And this is not something that was inevitable, because for a long time, you're right, Nathalie, that the US will always be, let's say, the dominant power when it comes to military, but also ties and leverage with Israel, right, in the Middle East, and also, of course, the security partnerships that it has with other Arab countries. But Europe was always, Arabs were happy to have Europe around as a complement in addition to the US. I did around the Arab world since October 7, and while they have told me everything I've just said. They also said, we do need Europe. Like, we need Europe to be back in this game, because they're also very lucid about the fact that America is huge, America is far away, America does have to deal with what it perceives to be the biggest pacing challenge of the generation, which is China. And so the Arabs are also very conscious of the fact that America's attention span on the Middle East is going to run out. But who's going to remain and who can remain engaged? It is the Europeans. But the Europeans aren't supplying an offer that has also adjusted to the new way of doing business in the Arab world, which is more utilitarian.
Can I try and come up with an offer?
Sure.
In my previous job, we came up with an offer which they find interesting. First, we had a discussion, especially with African countries, about energy transition. African countries and Middle Eastern countries. So, of course, Europeans went there and said, you need to move away from fossil fuels and you need to go to sustainable energy, etc. And they said, well, piss off. You've been using fossil fuels for generations, and now you're telling us we can't do the same thing you've done? You hypocrites. And they were right. And then we sort of rethought our message, and we said, wait a minute. You've got endless amounts of sun. Take the gas you need.
Exactly.
Be careful with oil, we would advise. Do what you want. But within a couple of years, if we do it right, you will be making a lot more money with solar energy and wind energy, and you will be able to produce so much electricity that you can't use. You can put that in hydrogen, and then we create a new partnership. This is a huge opportunity.
Yes.
But then European businesses will have to adapt to the situation that if you want to do that offer, you don't want to create African nations that just give you the hydrogen. You have to build up an industry based on hydrogen there.
Yes.
And if we are able as Europeans to step into that potential and not just leave that to the Chinese who are doing this and the Indians who are doing this at breakneck speed, that would give a whole new meaning to European, African, European, Middle East partnership.
It would redraw the relationship.
In fact, can I actually connect these 2 points? Because I think this is really important.
This is the last point. We're going to go to the public because there's a dernier métro, and I want to go to Tom Holland, Tom Middendorp.
Yeah. Because I think, what Riem was saying is, okay, so there used to be once upon a time the world in which we did human rights, and now we've kind of realized the world is kind of a big, bad, ugly place. And so we kind of know that we have to become big, bad, and ugly too. But the problem is that the way in which that has translated, that badness, right, in, say, Africa is, we just therefore kind of give a bit of cash for migration.
I wouldn't say badness. I would say just be badasses. There's a difference between the two.
But here comes the badass, yeah? Because I think, sort of, in a sense, rather than just ending up in pure transactionalism, which basically means giving up on foreign policy, there is a way that still, to still have a principled policy, because what Frans Timmermans was talking about, the energy transition, is principled to the core, but it's not the old quote-unquote way of doing it, of, conditionality, and I lecture you on human rights and democracy. It's basically saying, we focus on a number of areas where principles are embedded in them, and that is the way of doing foreign policy in this world, which indeed it's become, with no longer the only kids on the block and all the rest of it.
Yeah, agreed.
I look at the audience because there's a dernier métro going in a short while. If there's anybody who'd like to, Zara Toxis, one of our editors, comes to you with the microphone in order we do a short round of questions, very short one, and
we have just had a day where we were mourning the many people that were killed in the war, and still we are talking war and war and war and weapons and aggression and power and our interests.
Yes, and your question
no
would be?
Other possibility? Can we not think about a possibility of peace?
Can we?
Yes, we can. But again, quoting Churchill, you don't negotiate with a tiger when your head is in its mouth. And Ukraine's head is in Russia's tiger's mouth. And we need to get that head out of the mouth. We need to get the tiger back into his cage. And that will require military might. It is inevitable. It's not because we want war. It's because if you are attacked and you want to make sure you don't become weaker and you don't become the next victim of aggression, you will have to defend.
I mean,
to quote Barack Obama, yes, we can. Yeah.
I would just add one thing, which is if the question is about, do you want us to talk about peace with Russia? The most important thing is that the people who are calling the shots in Russia are not interested in peace right now. There is no real, sustainable, proper peace offering from the Russians on the table. And it is up to them to do that peace offering since they're the ones who invaded a sovereign country. So if you're talking about that point, talk to the Russians, have them do peace, and we'll be happy to do peace. And in the meantime, in order to have peace, you need to prepare for war as well. I mean, they're yin-yang. This idea that peace-loving people don't have to worry about power and military power dynamics, I think is frankly naive, and it's the cocoon that was created for Europeans after World War II that Europeans need to get out of. I mean, that's the real world.
It's a privilege we're talking about. Last question, Sarah. Yeah, next to you.
Hello. I'm asking a question from a non-European perspective. And I don't know if I understood it correctly or not, so I'm phrasing it to correct me if I understood it wrongly. You are, I think, implicating that the dual standard is a non-existence and it is a lie provided and provoked by the Arab communities. Okay, so I'm hearing that I didn't understand it correctly, but I want to add that about this double standard, I think I have lived it and I have seen it very fast, like handshakes with activists from my country 1 minute and the next minute supporting the government. And I think another delusion here, there are two delusions I'm finding here as, again, a non-European, is that, first of all, I don't know how European people find their governments as representatives, but I think when we talk about the Middle East, maybe we should separate people and the government. And when we are shaking hands with governments, we shouldn't forget that there are people that are suffering from them when we are making deals. So yes, this double standard exists, and I think in the public opinion, in the world, it is now revealing itself. It is now working.
Thank you.
Another...
Okay.
I'm just going to maybe clarify. I don't think I said there was no double standard in the world. And I think if you listen carefully to what I was saying about how European action since the beginning of this war in Gaza has actually hurt European standing, it is because I said some European actions has sent the message that Palestinian human rights aren't as important. So I'm not sure how I said there is no double standard. What I do also want to say about the double standard issue is that double standards exist everywhere. It is not just a Western thing, and I think we should stop pretending that it is just a Western thing. A lot of people in the Arab world didn't care when Ukraine was invaded. Is that not a double standard? Just like a lot of people don't care what's happening in Sudan. Is that a double standard? It's not just Westerners who don't care about others who don't look like them. And I think the faster we agree and we accept that, the faster we can get to a place where we can be constructive all together in order to get to a place, I think the same place we all want to go to.
Well,
Thank you for asking questions. Thank you for clarifying.
I need to add a couple of things. First of all, yes, in foreign policy, there's very often double standards across the board. But as Europeans, if we pretend that human rights, morality, rule of law are our guiding principles in foreign policy, and then we don't apply them, then of course we are very vulnerable. Russians and Chinese and others don't even pretend. So they can't be accused of double standards because their standards are dismal, but they don't hide it. So if we really want our moral principles to be guiding in foreign policy, we have to accept the consequences or be branded as hypocrites. It's as clear as that. And secondly, I want to say about double standards. You know, in the Arab world, and it's a bit harsh that I say this, but in the Arab world, there is very, very little real love for the plight of the Palestinian people, frankly. And we as Europeans need to take our responsibility. We've done it for many years. We're now neglecting this responsibility. We need to contribute. And if we do not just hold on, even long term, to the concept of a two-state solution, we have nothing else to offer. And I worry terribly about tendencies also in our society that there should be a one-state solution, which implies either no right of existence to a Palestinian state or no right of existence of Israel. And both are impossible propositions. So if we really want to have an influence on the situation, this plight of the Palestinian people should be front and center in European action, and we should be the ones keeping the idea ultimately of a two-state solution alive. It will not happen with Netanyahu and his coalition partners. It will never happen with Hamas. So we need to foster political forces in Israel and in Palestine who are willing to think about this long term. It's the only way out of this quagmire.
Thank you very much. You had a point. We're coming to that. I'm asking another guest at our table, General Middendorp. Tom Middendorp, please, if you would join us. Wonderful. I would like to introduce you briefly, as I did to the other speakers. He's a retired general of the Royal Netherlands Army, served as Chief of Defence of the Armed Forces of the Netherlands from 2012 till 2017, has been previously served as serving as commander of Task Force Uragan, part of the International Security Assistance Force, and many other things. Still senior advisor on many levels, chairman of the International Military Committee on Climate and Security. Very warm welcome to you. Before I go back to you, you had a last one. I'd like to ask you, Tom Middendorp, listening into this, we need to get our defense over 2%, maybe even our spending. We need to really act on Ukraine. It's the military who has to do it. How are you listening into this as an ex-chief of our armed forces?
Well, I listen to this as a big change.
Big change.
Ukraine did make a change. Ukraine was also for the politicians a wake-up call. Mm-hmm. If you look at the last 40 years, all political parties were living in an illusion, and also our societies were. So I agree with what has been said, that we have been living in a kind of a golden cage, in an era of a golden illusion. We are all born in peace here. We are raised in peace, and peace is for us is a normal. We are not used to work for our peace. Mm-hmm. And we have to relearn that. We are not used to do the dirty work to keep peace in our countries. And we have to relearn that. We are not used to invest in that. What our political discussions were about how to divide all the wealth that we have on social systems, educational systems, etc., etc. How to use the wealth, but not how to protect it. And I think Ukraine, in that sense, brought us into the big world. And I think the EU really needs to mature. The EU has been a very internally focused organization, economically driven. There is an increasing political dimension to the EU, and there is also an enormous potential. But it has been driven by nation interests and by more the economic side. And I think we need to create more synergy in Europe, and also mature ourselves in how to act in this globalized world and in this more fragmented world that has been discussed here at the table, which means that we have to develop, especially the foreign policy side. What I've noticed, I've been involved in more than 20 missions all over the world. And whenever I...
Yes, personally, yeah.
Yeah, directly or indirectly. I've not been in the fights, but all everywhere, but I've been responsible for them. And what I've noticed is that we only send military in a reactive sense when things go wrong. So we are always reacting to things. And that's the first lesson we should draw, to become more proactive. More proactive at reading the signs behind what's happening in Ukraine, behind what's happening in Israel. But we can kind of, as long as there is no trouble, we can go on dealing with the daily business as we are dealing with. And when it goes wrong, then we start acting. But then even then we start acting in a way that is harmless for us. So we pay off. Like the migration issue, we pay countries off, we put money in it, and then we try to solve it with money, which worked until now. But things are changing. I think Ukraine shows the big change. For the first time, we are confronted with war on our territory, and we feel very uncomfortable with that. And we don't know how to deal with that. And that's also a kind of an explanation why we are so looking for ways on how to deal with it. It is fear, but it is also because we are not used to it. We have to, so we have to grow up, I would say, and lose our naive way of living. And if I look at the world, it's not just about Ukraine, because Ukraine has also to do with this fragmenting world order, and people taking their chances there. But there are a few other big trends going on now, like the population growth in the world. We are doubling in size the world population to 11 billion people. It's enormous. At the same time, we have resource scarcity, so we have a growing gap between demand and supply worldwide. And in a fragmented world, that will create a lot of competition over access to resources. Our whole economy drives on this access to resources, which means that we can see many, many more friction areas around the world. And Europe has to learn how to protect its interests in all those areas. And I would say, and I agree with Frans Timmermans, invest in partnerships. Invest in partnerships in those regions. And not partnerships in the sense that we tell them what to do, but in the sense that they are full partners and that we accept them as partners and don't try to moralize everything they do. And that's what you also said. You can integrate that in the cooperation that you initiate.
Mm-hmm.
Can I come back to this double standards business, but then also react to this point? On the double standards, I think it's important to clarify exactly what's meant here, because I think there are double standards and double standards. So there's the double standard that means the EU has double standards because it stands for rights in Ukraine and not in Palestine. And I think that is the type of double standards that indeed you can make the argument that everyone has double standards. However, I think there's a different type of double standards which is very peculiar to the West, precisely because they have the ambition, and I don't know if it's double standards or hypocrisy, I think it's probably more hypocrisy than double standards. They have the ambition to have, principles, as opposed to the Russia, the Chinas that don't even, in a sense, try and pretend.
The North Koreans or whatever.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think there's on that second issue, so on the first, kind of everyone does it in different ways, right? On the second issue, I think it's an open question, what's our argument here? Do we therefore say that we shouldn't have those double standards, meaning we shouldn't even pretend to want rights?
So lower our standards.
Or lower our standards, and I think that is basically the route that we're taking. My fear
at the moment in our foreign policy.
On our foreign policy, exactly. My fear is that our awakening to the big, bad and ugly world is thinking that is therefore how we have to become. Now, I think, and I think this connects to the point that John was making here, because I think there is a specific difficulty that the European Union has. The European Union is, in my view, an intrinsically liberal project, meaning it is not a state, right? It is fundamentally based on principles like human rights and the rule of law and interdependence and multilateralism. It is that kind of construct, yeah? It's inherently liberal. And it kind of grew up in a world which felt like it was kind of going in that direction. Now, all of a sudden, the world is going in reverse gear. Well, I mean, not entirely. There are are still elements of openness that obviously, coexist with closure. But in a sense, where as a state let's take economic policy as an example. A state can say, we need to kind of go back to the 1970s, and what was that industrial policy? And let's try and reinterpret it in a 21st century way, but it's there in the DNA, yeah?
Of the nation state.
Of the nation state. It's not in the DNA of the EU to, and this is why I think the clumsiness to an extent, yeah? And this kind of oscillation between...
And this lack of proactiveness Tom Middendorp was talking about.
Exactly. In a sense, we have to invent. We don't have to kind of dig back from our past. We have to invent something that the EU never had. Yeah, but we have to do it in a way which
use
doesn't.
Soft power as foreign policy and
but also without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, without thinking, therefore we have to become bad ourselves. Yeah, I mean, but maybe slightly badder. We were not that great anyway.
Tom Middendorp, if I come back to what you're saying, we need to be more proactive. We're reacting to our missions, at least, in the world. We're reactive. What do you mean with proactive? It sounds good in a way, but it sounds also very scary. Should that mean that we should sort of actively go there and put boots on the ground, or what is proactive?
Well, proactive is not just military, it's a whole of government approach.
So,
so proactive means that you assess the driving powers behind friction, behind conflicts. For instance, we were fighting piracy in Somalia.
For instance.
The pirates we caught were poor farmers.
Yeah.
Who didn't have a choice.
Who turned into being pirates.
They turned into pirates because of the droughts, because of climate change. The increasing droughts drove them away from their homelands. They couldn't find any work. They were desperate, and they found this alternative.
Yeah.
They didn't have a choice.
So look after the agriculture in Somalia.
Yeah.
And
so we are putting plasters on a wound that is infected.
Right.
But we don't deal with the infection. And that's what we are doing. So I think we need to look beneath the surface of these conflicts and address these root causes in our foreign policy. And to use all the instruments that we have, economic instruments, political instruments, diplomatic, military, to do that. And also the military can contribute here. We can build partnerships with different regions and countries to help them build this resilience and to avoid them from collapsing, to avoid them from sliding away.
So you said it's a real change. The recent Ukrainian war, which is only an escalation, of course, of already a war of over 10 years, but changed in your mind sort of the conversation we're having here at the table?
I hope it is a wake-up call. It was a shock, but I hope it is a wake-up call, because I also know politicians have a short memory.
Well, that's also partly because they are there for a very short period, because then they're voted out. But
look at China. China, they are chess players. And the Russians as well. But Russia looks more tactically. China looks very strategically.
The long view.
Long term. They think in generations. They were seizing rights for all kinds of resources, natural resources, 30 years ago. We are now waking up that we need those resources.
It took us 30
years. We are 30 years behind.
It took us 30 years? Yeah. So we're 70 years behind, we're 30 years behind.
Yeah.
So we're in a hurry.
We are in a hurry, but that doesn't make me pessimistic. But we have to pick it up. We have an enormous potential, politically, economically. We have an enormous innovative industrial base in Europe. So I think we can pick up, but we have to change our mindset.
And if you listen into, maybe you have seen it, maybe you haven't, but Macron, Europe is in mortal danger. And he says, among many things, but he says we need now a new European security framework. Sounds French, and sounds also new. What would your reaction as as former chief of our army, a new to that?
I think to a certain extent he is right. Europe is not capable of projecting force. Some countries are a little bit. And some countries can organize that, but Europe as a whole has no structure to do that. Has no command and control facilities like the NATO has. But we also wouldn't want to duplicate everything that NATO has. We are dual-headed. We work both for NATO and the EU, most countries. So you have to find a way on how to protect our interests within NATO as much as possible, but also to protect your own interests without the US when needed, as an EU. And that part has not developed. The whole defense part of the EU is hardly developed. And there is a military staff, and they look at military contributions to foreign efforts, but it is very, very limited. And they have no authority at all over what's happening in countries.
You want to chip in?
Yeah, I mean, you brought up President Macron and, you know, love him, hate him, think he's right all the time, think he's right half the time or never. What is striking is that, what I don't get is that why aren't other European leaders standing up and making these grand speeches or giving a 17-page long interview to The Economist in which...
That's the online version, but yeah.
Yeah, that's like the actual transcript. It's 17 pages long. And it's not the first time, by the way. Every one of his long interviews is like this. It's just interesting that he's not right all the time, and sometimes he makes things worse because of the way he says certain things. But at least he has the credit and the merit of trying to create a framework, trying to create this new way for Europeans to exist in this new world. And you know, he's kind of making it up as he's going. He's been doing it for 7 years. Some of the things he's been saying have been remarkably consistent. This whole idea about architecture...
Something different in 2019 in The Economist, totally different, but he's making it up along. So.
Well, he did and he didn't. So on the architecture of security and the need to create a new architecture of security in Europe, aka the framework of security, he's been saying it literally from the first day he was elected. You know, he's tinkered with it here and there, but it has evolved because obviously it has evolved with reality, and that's, I think, a good thing. Just like his position on NATO, I mean, thankfully he didn't say again that it was brain dead because he saw that it isn't brain dead. And he, I think, had the intellectual honesty to say that had the US not been led by Biden, but also not existed, Ukraine and Europe would have been in deep trouble in 2022. So, you know, he does have that intellectual honesty. You also can't expect a president to just do a huge mea culpa like a normal person and say, oh, you know, I was really wrong about that. That's not going to happen. It's just not the kind of animals they are. But it's just interesting that he constantly engages in this exercise, whereas no one else in Europe does. Like, where is the big, you know, strategic, intellectual, conceptual speech that Scholz gave about Europe and how what is the European model for this new day and age? And if that happened, there would be a real conversation, and maybe the Europeans could create this new model together. Right now, it just feels like he talks. Those who want to support him are like, yay, and then he has a hard time delivering. That's a problem that he does have. And then there's the others who are like, oh my God, can't he just shut up? Like, we're just gonna put our heads in the sand and it'll go away. And I think neither is helping Europe.
What would you think about a new...
Well, I think I can agree with that. We struggle to think strategically. And Macron's trying to think strategically, but most of the politicians in Europe are managers of their countries. Yeah. But they are not global players. They don't know how to play that game. And Macron's trying to do that. Whatever you say of him, I cannot be the judge of that. And I think we need to develop that capacity to think strategically. And we have lost that.
Yeah, and it's a particular problem because, in a sense, it's okay to be a manager if things are going,
reasonably well.
Yeah. I mean, you know, they can always go better, right?
Not in a crisis.
But not in a crisis, yeah, and not in a multiple crisis like the one that we're facing, exactly. And one in which, in a sense, if you look at the next year ahead, not even 10 years ahead, the next year ahead, the most optimistic scenario, which is hugely unrealistic, is that things remain as they are, right? That's where we are. So thank goodness that there is one European leader, right, that is at least putting some ideas out and, sort of saying the unthinkable, boots on the ground, for instance, right?
Is that unthinkable?
Well, I don't think it is. I actually agree with him. Not so much because, I think the main point of agreement is not so much because they should or should not be there, but the main point is saying that, they could be, or they could not. I mean, why on earth are you going to tell your enemy what you're going to do?
But I would say it's your trade. Would that be unimaginable?
Well, it's a big dilemma, because if you don't, this conflict will continue. Putin can he has his war economy rolling,
and then the Chinese have what they want. As Frans Timmermans.
China is the laughing third party. It will go on.
So that's
and on and on.
To my ears, that's yes. It's not unimaginable.
No, I don't think so. And as Frans directly put it, the unimaginable can become imaginable when we all find a need for it. So if we want to avoid another hundreds of thousands of people dying there, we might need to make a bigger step.
But I would add that strategic ambiguity play, it needs to also be backed up by facts and capabilities in order to
strategic ambiguity play, that's sort of deterrence, that you sort of...
saying, I don't know whether I would do it.
Saying I might do it or I might not. I'm not defining my red lines very clearly because I'm going to keep you guessing. That's part of strategic ambiguity. But for that to be credible and for that to truly, let's say, disturb the one plus one equals 2 equation in Putin's mind, for that to actually be effective, it needs to be backed up by real capabilities and credibility.
What are real capabilities?
And right now, I think Europe is having a hard time doing that. Real capabilities is, for example, announcing that Europe is going to be able to deliver 1 million munitions, 155 millimeter caliber munitions, and actually doing it by March. Not saying, come on, we deserve good credit because we are trying and we are participating. And it's like, war is here. And in war, you don't get a medal just for participating. Either you die or you live.
War is here? War is here?
War is here. Our continent is at war. Yeah. I mean, I think, for instance, on this issue of capability, I think the mistake, which in fairness was not just a European mistake, it was also an American mistake, was somehow thinking, and maybe it was to an extent much, much less even a Ukrainian mistake, in thinking that there would be a Ukrainian counteroffensive and there was a theory of victory behind it, not necessarily liberating every inch of land militarily, but liberating enough for it to trigger a political change in Russia. And that actually, therefore, if that theory of victory panned out to be true, it would not be a long, long, long war, And so that's why the orders at the beginning of the war weren't coming in. I think that the realization that if victory is going to come, or if defeat is going to be avoided, it will come in a different way, only really started sinking in 6 months ago.
But I beg to differ. At the beginning, very, very beginning, Putin and Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. I remember very clearly, by April, you had military experts saying, munitions, start working on munitions, where no one is making munitions enough. Do it. It took a year for politicians to start talking about munitions. That had nothing to do with the theory of victory. It had to do with incompetence and not wanting to listen to the military experts.
You seem to be agreeing, Tom Middendorp. Incompetence.
I think we don't have the sufficient decisiveness and speed. So we are just taking steps too little, too late. We announced and we agreed that we would deliver tanks, and then we deliver a few tanks, not many, a year later or half a year later. And Putin is completely prepared for all those tanks that are coming. He has been preparing defensive lines for half a year. Well, then you can build a very big defensive line that is impenetrable for that the little force that you can produce. So we are constantly lacking behind, and we have to scale up. And that's where we find it very difficult to do. We all say we need more ammunition, but no country wants to build factories to do that. Who wants to produce bullets? So we all recognize the need for it, but we don't want to take the burden. And that's the mindset shift that we need. I do see it shifting slowly, I also see the investors making a shift now towards, okay, it's not dirty to invest also in our capability to defend our economies and our interests, but that's far too late for what's happening in Ukraine.
Can I just add one thing? I think you're right that it wasn't just a European thing. The American play, I think, was a little different in the way that it hurt the Europeans. For the longest time, 60 years, you know, America wanted to be the main supplier of weapons to Europe. It's kind of part of the unspoken and very spoken sometimes deal underlying European security. And so the Europeans weren't prepared, didn't have the capability or the capacity even to scale up because, you know, part of their transatlantic bond is that they will continue buying these weapons from the US. And then American politics happen, and you have 7 months of delay that will be very difficult for the Ukrainians to make up. And I wonder if this episode should not push more Europeans to think, yes, we are very attached to America. America is a unique security partner, but we do need more European defense, and one shouldn't happen at the expense of the other. It should happen together. And that also requires a shift in mentality in DC, in the US, where American politicians need to accept that perhaps Europeans will buy a little less, so they will create a little less jobs in Pennsylvania and Delaware and all these places. But it will allow the US to do more in the Pacific, where it wants to go, while having a Europe that continues to be strong and prosperous and so support the American economy. And that is something that is still far away and difficult in the US.
It can be very complementary, and the US get what they ask for.
Yeah.
So they want Europe to be stronger and to be a stronger partner. That's what we invest in. But it also demands a change in our nations, in our member states. Because our defense industries are very fragmented. We have small industries, very national driven, and we have many small factories, but we don't have a few big factories. So we need to consolidate our industrial base. And that's something that's going on in the European Defence Fund and in the European circles now as a kind of an intention, but that really needs to be stepped up. If we don't consolidate our industrial base, we will never be able to do this. And that requires that we pull things to a more European level. And that's maybe the good thing of what we see happening at this moment, that when we are confronted with crisis, COVID crisis, Ukraine crisis, this cohesion becomes a bit stronger, and there is more acceptance of mandates going to a European level. And I think we need to use that now that the window is open.
But let me make the Italian point in the Netherlands. Now, to do that in a context of war, the only way of doing it is a lot more money at European level, in the sense that the financial, institutional, regulatory incentives that were set up until now, I mean, it's not like they produce nothing, you know, but they produce a sort of incremental change that maybe in 60 years' time would lead to a result. But the war is now. And so you need a shock to the system, and that shock to the system can only come through a lot of money, as in not 1.5 billion, but more like 100. So I think this
common lending, just say it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you know, a next-gen EU-like fund for defense. You know, I don't see any other way of doing this, you know, because the incentives set up so far, as I said, would lead to, if ever, that results in decades' time.
Is that just conceivably realistic, this amount, and then we go to the public, back to the public? But is that, if what it takes, would that be? Well, you know,
it's back to, you know, it becomes thinkable when, you know, the unthinkable becomes thinkable when you don't have an alternative.
Listen, it became thinkable during COVID.
Exactly.
European countries understood, even the most frugal did, that the only way to recover, for the European economy to recover, was to do a common lending and debt. And I think it's taking a little more time now, but yeah, eventually, hopefully. But if they don't come to this conclusion, then they won't have the ability to scale up. I mean, it is as simple as that. It's a one-to-one relationship.
So we need a whole economic reform a different way of looking at our economy, also towards Washington and also among ourselves. That's not going to happen tomorrow, well, I'm afraid, as somebody who watched the European Union develop for several decades. But on this not so positive note, I think if there's anybody who wants to join in, then Zara Tocci is coming to you.
Hello, thank you for your wonderful insights and for sharing those throughout the evening. I have one question that concerns a little bit more the internal processes of decision-making within the European Union. Is the institutional makeup of the European Union about common foreign policy even up to date to tackle all these problems? You've touched upon this before, where it's like a new situation that forces us into making these decisions. Do you think that is possible, even with a system of unanimity required from member states to make these decisions?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. You know, I mean, if you were to ask me which are the two things that need to happen today to make things radically different, I would say definitely moving beyond unanimity is one, and secondly, putting a lot of money in the kind of things that we're talking about being the second. And actually, these two things are intimately connected to one another, because unanimity is part of the reason which also prevents agreement on doing ambitious things together. So I absolutely agree with you. What I would also add is that what worries me is that whereas I see the external, sort of the priorities, the European foreign policy priorities moving forward, in a sense, are driven by an external context. It's defense, it's enlargement, it's geoeconomics, almost regardless of what the politics in our countries are. I think these will be the priorities in the next few years. What worries me is that all of these things, to be tackled effectively, require a lot more integration. And the politics in Europe, as we know, is moving in the opposite direction, right? So whereas I could imagine a more, say, right-leaning EU, yes, agreeing that, we need to do defense and geoeconomics and enlargement, yeah? But will they agree on, moving beyond unanimity on these issues? Will they agree on putting the real money at EU level? Very difficult to see it.
Yeah. What's very hard to achieve in a fragmenting world that we live in is consensus. So if you have a decision-making concept based on consensus, in a crisis time, it will be almost impossible to speed that up. And we also see that in the UN, on the global level. We see the same thing happening. It's all based on consensus, which means that it's becoming harder and harder to come to global agreements on all the issues we are facing. So we have to find new ways, new multilateral ways of decision-making. Part can be dealt with in that framework that we talked about. There you can make arrangements, more crisis type of arrangements. In a time of crisis, these mandates go to that level. And then you don't need to go through this consensus mechanism model, but you do have to organize it.
Zara, is there a question?
Well, they chose herself who wants to answer. My question is, isn't the main reason for the delay of delivering of munition, etc., is that the politicians as well as the European public still believe it isn't their war, and they are not ready to make sacrifices for that. I was this afternoon at a discussion in The Hague about European politics, and it took half an hour before somebody mentioned Ukraine. The lady for the Foreign Office who was there was talking about playing level field, about Dutch priorities for European politics nowadays was for her was playing level field and such stuff, and she didn't talk about Ukraine. So isn't that the main reason?
Yeah. I mean,
Reem?
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think you're right. I think for some it is, and it is very present in their mind, and it makes them worry a lot. And for some, it remains something that is far away. But if you're talking specifically about delays in delivering weapons, it also is as silly or dumb as not enough money, not enough factories, not enough raw materials, like, you know, gunpowder in order to make the actual munitions. So there's also an issue of just the logistics of supply chains and having factories. You know, it's not as highbrow, but it is part of sort of reality. And then, yes, there is that political side, but I wouldn't say, because I do think there has been a big improvement and progress since February 2022, I think around European countries, where they now understand that more than they ever did before, that, you know, Putin is not their friend, even though he said it to them in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference. It took a while, and then, you know, he invaded a bunch of other countries. But anyway, 2022, they did understand in the end. And I think that, you know, it's going to be hard to go back to how it was before. So that's the positive in what's happened so far.
But let me add something that actually I heard in Kyiv, you know, about 3 weeks ago when I was there, which I think speaks precisely to this point. This colleague said to me, the Ukrainian colleague said to me, you know what the problem is? He said, you still consider, not you Europeans, yeah, you the West, still consider us your good other. So we're the good guys, yeah. You like us, we understand that. You know, you're helping us, but you are the, you know, we are the other. And indeed, I think, you know, until there is that otherness, even if it's in, you know, Putin is the bad other, right? We will not treat them as part of us, which means that indeed then you get hooked up on the technical delays and the, you know, which is the other part of the story, I think.
And the third part of the story is the private sector. The private sector, they want to boost their industries, but they do need some long-term assurance. Because now there is a high demand, but maybe in 1 or 2 years the demand drops again, and then they are there with their factory that is losing money. So they do need long-term commitments, and that costs money. And either the EU or nations have to compensate that. If you want to keep that capacity up for wartime, then you have to maintain it in peacetime when there is a lower need. And that is not the efficient way of working we are used to.
War is never efficient. No. I'm afraid, and security is expensive. There are many allies we didn't take. We could have taken a total different direction from the speech of Frans Timmermans. But that's also a good thing, because it was a dense evening with a lot of ideas of thinking out loud. So I want to thank my speakers very, very much for doing that, for being so frank and also being so critical, so very critical, I would say, on the foreign policy we have in war times. And I'm afraid we established that there's no question mark, but there's an exclamation mark behind the title of this evening. I'm terribly sorry to say so, but I want to thank the public. I've overdone my welcome by 10 minutes. It says here 22:05. I'm terribly sorry about that, but it was also because of the very interesting conversations we had. A different conversation, I think, than from we would have had for the past years. A totally different conversation. I agree with that, Tom Middendorp. So thank you, Tom Middendorp, Nathalie, Tocci, and Momtaz, and of course Frans Timmermans, who is no longer with us. But tomorrow we might be having a cabinet, and we'll see him probably somewhere on TV telling what he thinks about that. At least that's what every pundit says. That, you know, the second chamber needs to clear its agenda, because we might have a cabinet. We don't know, at least an agreement. We don't know, of course, who will be leading it. Probably not Frans Timmermans, maybe somebody from the PvdA, though. I heard that there's at least 2 Putters and Plasterk who could be. Anyway, we'll see that tomorrow. We have ample things to talk about at the bar. Hopefully some of you will stay and talk over what we've heard. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much to partners for doing this. I'm very, very happy.